Howdy, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Meet Your Herdmates Sodcast. Today, I am so pleased to be joined by one of the original Sod sisters, Amy Berger, all the way from the other side of the country. Amy, welcome.
Thank you. Good to see you. Happy to be with the Sod Father today.
It's my pleasure. So Amy has 15 years experience eating in a way that some people haven't recognized as a viable option for humans to eat. That's interesting. And she's not doing this without some degree of training and information. Your title is Certified Nutrition
Specialist, CNS.
Specialist,
Yeah.
CNS. And that required a degree, which in your case was a graduate degree. Is that right?
Yeah. So the CNS credential is on par with the RD, with the registered dietitian. It's a different type of education, but the CNS, you have to have a master's degree. And just like for the RD, you have to have supervised hours and pass a board exam.
Okay. I need a cheat sheet to know what all the acronyms stand for. So I want to make sure I get it right. So this woman's got skills here, people. This is not just, somebody who read a couple blogs and now, no, I'm just kidding.
Well, I do that too, but
You write a blog, so toitnutrition.com, yes?
yes.
And that's also where you can find her on Twitter. So how, climbing into the Wayback Machine to 15 years ago, what was it? How did you find this? What was it in your own experience that said, yeah, I think I want to try that?
Right. So, of course, for people watching and listening, when Peter said I eat in a kind of different way than a lot of people eat, I follow a low carb diet. And sometimes it's a ketogenic diet, which is a very, very low carb diet. Sometimes it's just low carb. But I was a chubby kid. My parents owned an ice cream store. I was literally a kid in a candy store, and it took its toll. And, as I got older, though, I became a little more concerned about my appearance, as any woman growing up in the 80s and 90s did. And I followed, what I thought was a healthy diet. I exercised. I was no stranger to working out, eating my healthy whole grain cereal with my skim milk and my margarine on my whole grain bread, and the weight would not budge. And I didn't have any health problems. I was just carrying extra weight, but I have a family history of type 2 diabetes, obesity, stroke, and cancer. So we are all stocked up in the family.
Hmm.
And after working so hard for so long and just really beating myself up and blaming myself for not losing weight, I actually stumbled upon the Atkins diet. My mother, we're talking long enough ago, she got a copy at a yard sale when people still had yard sales. And she never read it, but I did, and it made sense to me. And I said, I'll try this. I've tried everything else and nothing worked. I might as well. And lo and behold, it worked. And it worked. And not only did it work, I got to eat really delicious food. I got to eat cheese and bacon and steak and vegetables. I still eat. I probably eat more vegetables now than I did before, because instead of eating pasta and bread and rice and potatoes, what else is on my plate besides chicken and meat? It's going to be these vegetables. And over the years, I was so fascinated, why does this work? I'm doing the opposite of what I'm quote unquote supposed to do. Why is this working? How is it working? So I kind of was self-taught, just reading some of the science as much as I could understand it. And I was in and out of jobs that I just was not satisfied by, did not find fulfilling. And it occurred to me, hey, nutritionist is a career. Like I could do that, and I could help other people learn about this really cool way of eating. So that's what I did. I went back to school to get the formal training in nutrition. And now that's what I do. I help other people, and I write, and I in my evolution of learning about this way of eating and the biology and the chemistry of how it works, I really feel at this point that weight loss is one of the least impressive things that this diet can do. I mean, for those Those that are new, this is going to sound crazy, but it's absolutely true. You can reverse type 2 diabetes. You can reverse PCOS. It's good for men with the enlarged prostate gland, the BPH, acne, migraines, hypoglycemia, non-alcoholic fatty liver. I mean, the list goes on and on. Oh, and you also might lose a few pounds along the way. So that's the long version of my story.
Well, yeah, and there's a lot there just to go back to, but so this started 15 years ago. At some point, you pursued the certified nutritional
Specialist.
specialist. Thank you. Glitch. Yeah, tell me about brain health and memory. We'll need that later. But so when did that come in your journey relative to the start? And you have a degree in creative writing as well, right?
Yeah.
How does
Yeah.
that
So
slot into this?
it's actually, I'm glad you're asking, because a lot of people that want to change their diet, whether it's to a low carb diet or anything else, it doesn't stick the first time. You kind of have to try it you try and fail, and one day it sticks. And that was true for me. I was not one of these people who all of us, I was born and raised in New York. I was eating a bagel the size of my head every single day, and I didn't change my diet overnight. So I tried it many times. When I first learned about it, I was actually in college. So it's more than 15 years ago. And I did it for a little bit, and I just wasn't emotionally prepared to make it my life at that point, or to make it my permanent way of eating. But I knew that it worked. And it was a few years later that I kind of came back to it and stuck with it for the full time. That was around 2003 or 2004. I'm an Air Force veteran, and I was trying to get into the military. This was after I was in school. It's kind of a long story, but I was too heavy. I was above the maximum weight to be allowed to enlist.
Mm.
And I didn't know what to do. I needed to get the weight off, and I needed it to happen quickly. So I said, okay, that low carb, I know that thing works. So what I'm going to do, and I don't recommend this to anyone listening, I basically stopped eating. I stopped eating. And when I got so hungry that I needed to eat, I knew I just needed to eat something with no carbs. So I'm not kidding you when I tell you I lived on Oscar Mayer bologna. I lived on the little processed cheese singles, but it worked, and I was in the military. And basically ever since then, I've been on some version of a low carb diet. Again, not always very, very strict, but always limiting my carbohydrate intake to some extent. And I didn't go back to school for this until 2000, when was it? 2010. So I got my master's in 2012 for this.
Mhm.
And so then I've been working as a professional since about 2013.
And currently you are working with individuals these days remotely.
Yeah, and I mean, even before the shutdown, I was doing, most people find me online anyway. They find me through my blog or through Twitter or something. I am right now in Durham, North Carolina. So for the rare person that does live near me, we can meet up in person.
Okay. Okay. So you mentioned PCOS. What does that stand for, please?
So that's polycystic ovarian syndrome, and it's the #1 cause of infertility in the industrialized world. And it's basically, if women out there are dealing with it, it's irregular menses or anovulation. They tend to, there's growth of facial hair. It tends to come along with being overweight, but not always. Not every woman that has this is heavy. Acne. Trying to think of, because there's a lot of other hormonal changes that happen. One of them is that these women tend to have elevated testosterone, so they take on some male characteristics like the facial hair, sometimes a hoarse voice, the sort of oilier skin. Yeah, and it's horrible because it's actually fairly simple to reverse that with a diet. I mean, I have a blog post on it. Maybe we can link to that or something. But the main cause of that condition is chronically high insulin. And in fact, I mean, there's a lot of women with PCOS who know that it might be a blood sugar issue because doctors prescribe metformin for it. Metformin is a diabetes drug.
Okay. Okay, so this most common form of infertility, certainly people should be aware that there's a possible diet / lifestyle intervention. There's obviously people undergoing a lot of expense and trouble trying to treat it in other ways.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, not that those other ways don't work, but why not get your body why not correct the hormonal imbalance that's preventing the conception, because then if you're going to do it artificially, and no judgment, however a woman wants to go about this is her business, but what might be the potential consequences for that baby if it's conceived in a body that maybe wasn't in the proper hormonal position to conceive. So I think it's better, to whatever extent you can correct because if you have that imbalance, then what else might you end up with? Gestational diabetes, some other
Exactly.
metabolic problem that's going to affect that fetus, that's going to affect the baby, that could potentially affect it long term.
Yeah.
There's a lot of
In
consequences there potentially.
in livestock, we are looking at something that's called fetal imprinting. And certainly how, for example, the mama cow is fed in the last portion of that pregnancy is going to affect how that offspring produces. So
Yeah.
somehow we can do things in animal science that we can't do in human medicine and human
Or that we
nutrition.
don't think we forget that humans are animals and
Now,
things that
wait a
we eat
minute. Are
in
you
other
sure about
animals,
that?
we
Really?
completely forget, like, oh, maybe that has something we could learn from.
Right. You radical, you. So
Some of us are more animalistic than others, but
th- we're not casting any aspersions looking at you, Sean Baker. Um, okay. So now I was just watching an interview that you did with Brett Scher, and so forgive me if this is something that we've already touched on, but when you said that especially young women unfortunately become unhealthily focused on an unhealthy body image, and get over concerned about their appearance. I think all humans in this society do to a certain extent, but certainly I believe that that's true for especially young women. We tend to look at this as something to lose weight, and yet I think there have been some relatively recent studies that show this dramatic metabolic transformation that can happen in the absence of weight loss. And these things can happen very early, even though we go on to lose weight. So there's this feedback loop of positive reinforcement. And
yeah, it's such an important thing for people to understand because when something like type 2 diabetes and obesity go hand in hand so often, they actually say they coined the phrase diabesity, except type 2 diabetes happens in thin people too. Hypertension happens in thin people. Gout happens. And all of these other issues happen in people all across the weight spectrum. So, how can we say that the solution is to lose weight? Well, if you have diabetes, you need to lose weight. If you have heart disease, you need to lose weight. What if you're already at a quote unquote normal weight, which you could do a whole podcast just on that phrase, normal weight. But there has to be a better solution because if somebody's not overweight, the answer to their medical problem can't be lose weight. So you're absolutely right that the metabolic changes that happen inside when you make this pretty big shift in your diet happen so quickly because the weight isn't the cause. If the weight were the cause, we wouldn't see any of these improvements until someone had already lost 20, 30, or 100 pounds. We see them immediately. Like those listening there, a lot of medical doctors use this low carb way of eating in their practice. For some of their patients that take insulin for type 2 diabetes, they have to either stop the patient's insulin or reduce the dose on literally the first day of the diet, because that's how quickly blood sugar starts to come down when you stop eating foods to jack up your blood sugar. So it's definitely these things happen sooner. And I think it's a really important message for people to understand that if they do have some of these issues, they don't need to blame themselves like, oh well, if I wasn't so heavy, I wouldn't have diabetes, or if I could just lose weight, then I wouldn't have this problem. No, the weight is actually one more symptom of the internal dysfunction that's driving all of the issues.
Mhm.
So gout might be your symptom. High blood pressure could be a symptom. Excess weight is also a symptom.
And that's why it's really important to be working with your healthcare team, especially if you're on these medications, because they need to be adjusted while you're undergoing this kind of change, because otherwise you may end up in a health emergency.
Yeah,
And
if you're
we
not on medication, you can pretty much fly solo. But if you are really, insulin is the biggie, and then some of the blood pressure medications, you just kind of want to make sure your doctor knows what you're doing.
and monitoring the
Yes.
positive results, which might end up training the doctor some more about what can happen. So that's not a bad thing. Um, okay. So this excess body weight or excess body fat, maybe more specifically, is part of a spectrum of metabolic derangement. You use the word hyperinsulinemia. Okay, so maybe we should talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a like a, what do they call it? A five-star word or an
Oh,
SAT word or something. So built into that bigger word is the word insulin. And I'm sure most people have heard of insulin. It's a hormone. And most people think of it as a blood sugar hormone because if anyone has ever heard of insulin, they've heard it in the context of somebody with diabetes injecting insulin to help control their blood sugar. Except what people really need to know is that that is only one of many, many other jobs insulin has. One of which, the biggest, well, maybe not the biggest, but a big one of which is inhibiting the burning of fat. If your insulin level is high most of the time, you are not going to be able to burn a lot of fat. So whether that means you have a really hard time losing body fat or you have sugar cravings all the time because your body is unable to burn a lot of fat, you are dependent on burning carbohydrate. So you're dependent on these like constant little infusions of carbs. You're snacking all day. And insulin does a whole lot more. I mean, we said about PCOS, when it's funny, it tends to have opposite effects in men and women. In women, there's hormones never do just one thing. It's like a spider web. You touch it and the whole thing moves. So in women, it tends to increase testosterone. In men, it tends to decrease testosterone and
mm,
raise estrogen. So in men, we see men like growing enlarged breasts. We see them becoming more effeminate, even their shape. They can start accumulating fat around their hip area. And it's, I guess, to take a step back too, this high insulin, this hyperinsulinemia, which just means your insulin level in your blood is high, it is a major, major factor in so many health issues. And most people don't know because doctors just don't routinely test insulin. When you go to a checkup, it's standard to get your blood sugar checked. And then if your blood sugar is normal, the doctor says, well, you're fine. You don't have diabetes. See you next time. Except for so many people, the blood sugar is normal because really high insulin is keeping it in check. And so even when the blood sugar is normal, the high insulin wreaks all kinds of havoc around all different parts of the body.
mhm. So, okay, something that we have to have enough of it. Um, but if we have too much of it for too long, then we start seeing these other conditions that you mentioned. And I think it's good to just kind of run through just a brief list, if we can, of things that are plausibly associated with hyperinsulinemia, just to give people a sense of the breadth of this issue?
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, to be clear, I don't want to scare people. Insulin is a hormone. The body makes it for a reason. We just don't want too much of it too often. Same thing like water and oxygen. Too much water, too much oxygen can kill you, but we definitely need some. So with the high insulin, for sure, and again, this is whether or not your blood sugar is high. Of course, in type 2 diabetes, it is high. So there's type 2 diabetes, fatty liver, gout, migraines, hypertension. For many people, it's skin tags,
Mhm.
the enlarged prostate, the benign prostate hypertrophy. Oh, there's so many more. Why can't I? Some people with, did I say migraines?
Mhm.
Um, I think we're going to talk a little more about, believe it or not, Alzheimer's disease,
Mm.
brain fog. Um,
We could
there's
end
some
up with
very
vision
limited with
loss.
fat. Sorry?
Vision loss,
Yeah, well, I
maybe.
mean, I think that comes along with the diabetes is the
Okay.
just damage to the eyes, kidney
Hmm.
dysfunction, and of course obesity and overweight. High
Mm.
insulin just makes it really easy to gain weight and really hard to lose it.
And tinnitus,
Yeah, actually,
tinnitus.
there's some interesting research about tinnitus or tinnitus. Some people we debate the way it's said. Vertigo, Meniere's disease. So these another five-star word. They're called cochleovestibular disorders, just disorders of inner ear and balance. So
Hmm.
that stuff. Very interesting, but limited for now. Research on things like Parkinson's and multiple sclerosis. So like neurodegenerative conditions.
Mm.
This thing just touches everything.
Yeah, I think the quote I got from Ben Bickman was that virtually every chronic disease is at least made worse by insulin resistance,
Yeah.
hyperinsulinemia.
Yeah. So in some cases, the insulin is the outright cause, but in some of these, I would totally agree. If it's not the cause, it's certainly not making it any better. It's probably
Hmm.
making it worse.
And again, what would lead to chronically elevated levels of insulin in the blood? Now, it's not just diet, but let's start there.
Yeah. So there's actually a lot of debate over what causes this. For most people, the thing that raises insulin is dietary carbohydrate, because insulin primarily at first is responding to the blood sugar. So anything that raises the blood sugar is going to raise the insulin. So I would say the worst offenders, so to speak, are liquid sugars, things like sugar sweetened soda, fruit juice, all these fruit smoothies that everyone thinks are so healthy. You're just putting this huge dump of sugar right into your body. You don't even have to chew it. That's going to enter your bloodstream extremely quickly. Um, and it seems, because there are people, it's not all carbohydrate that does this. And it seems to be the Dr. Ted Naiman calls it, well, he calls it the trifecta. There's a third factor, but carbs with a lot of fat together. So something like a donut, something like my beloved bagel with cream cheese that I ate every single day and couldn't understand why I wasn't losing weight, even though it was a whole grain bagel with margarine or, okay, full fat cream cheese. But it basically, so it's a long story. I will try to narrow it down. We each have a sort of personal, genetically determined threshold to store fat on our bodies. And we tend to store fat, in our hips and our thighs and our arms and our chins and everywhere. Once these storage compartments are full, if we still have to store more fat, the body has nowhere else to put it but in and around our organs, like the liver, the pancreas. When fat starts building up there, that is bad juju. And it takes more and more, because the body doesn't want to store fat there. It takes more and more insulin to force the body to do that. So I said insulin has many jobs. It helps control the blood sugar. It prevents fat burning. It helps fat storage. It basically takes things out of the bloodstream and shoves it anywhere it can. And so once the fat is starting to build up in this sort of abdominal area, that's one thing at least that I think contributes to this high insulin.
So carbohydrate can come in a couple forms. There's the carbohydrate that is in fiber, at least as labeled on products today. And then there's the rest of the carbohydrate that isn't. So anything that's fibrous would be digestible in a human by varying degrees, depending on what it is. I mean, for the most part, it's not going to be digested. Is that a correct?
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, fiber is just going to pass through you. And depending on the food it's wrapped up in, it can slow the absorption of the other carbs so that it doesn't quite have the same effect on your blood sugar and insulin. So that's why something like, when we think of carbs, we kind of automatically think of starch. We think of bread and pasta and potatoes. But broccoli is a carbohydrate. Lettuce is a carbohydrate. It's just not starchy.
Mhm.
Relatively speaking, it's carbs, but it's really, really low in carbs. So those are the kinds of carbohydrates that most people, there's exceptions, but most people can eat a generous amount of that and really have no problems with it whatsoever. Blood sugar wise, some people have, they don't digest it so well, they get very bloated, they get gas. But with regard to blood sugar and insulin, those are the kinds of carbs that are pretty benign. And it's the other stuff that really does a number on people. And so, of course, one of the worst things to do is set yourself up for that big blood sugar spike first thing in the morning with the bowl of cereal and the orange juice and the bran muffin and the grape jelly and all these things that we thought were good for us are setting us up to have this sugar burning metabolism all day.
Mhm. So if we're not going to digest carbohydrate and absorb it, then the energy primarily is going to come from fat. And it's interesting, over the years, I've heard people mention this and I've thought of it. No doctor will say that it's a bad idea to lose fat for your health, which means that we're burning it. But if we eat fat and burn it, somehow that's completely different. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, it's always fascinated me that, you know, doctors learn biochemistry. I know they do. They learn anatomy and physiology. Even in nutrition school, I had to learn this stuff. And yet, you can, because of the culture that we were all brought up in, you can learn that and still come away with an entirely different interpretation of, of what that means.
Hmm.
And in fact, any biochemistry textbook will tell you insulin inhibits fat burning. It's like
Hmm.
in plain English, and then we just completely forget that that's a thing.
Well, one of my textbooks over there, I could find it on the same page that it says that. On the same page, it also says that obesity is the result of overeating or sedentary behavior.
Yeah.
And that's not true, right?
Well, and not just obesity, we all have friends that were professional athletes that developed type 2 diabetes because
Mhm.
of their diet. Now, never mind, even if they weren't overweight, they were they weren't overweight, but they were eating so much carbohydrate to fuel that exercise that they still ended up with all these other metabolic problems.
Okay. All right. So I was joking earlier about my memory, but it's no laughing matter. Alzheimer's is one of the top five, or certainly top 10 causes of death in the United States, and it's a really painful process for the family members to care for a loved one who progressively loses awareness of who they are and who anyone else is. Um, and so you mentioned type 3 diabetes, and I've mentioned that to people who look at me as if I'm even stranger than I'll admit to being. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that, if you could?
Right. So, yeah, they regularly refer to Alzheimer's disease now as type 3 diabetes or diabetes of the brain. And you're right. I mean, I don't know the statistic off the top of my head of the where it falls in causes of death, but um, it is the number one most feared disease. People fear it even more than cancer because at
Mm.
least with cancer, the treatments are terrible, but they work sometimes. There are cancer survivors. There are no Alzheimer's survivors, right? Or there's a doctor that's working to make that not be true anymore. He's developing some protocols where he would like to say this will be the first generation where we have Alzheimer's survivors. But in the meantime, there's nothing that's really effective for these people. And the reason they call it type 3 diabetes is that the main malfunction in the brain of somebody with this disease is that the brain is not able to use glucose for fuel. And glucose comes from a lot of different things. The main thing is dietary carbohydrate. And so if your brain has become unable to burn this fuel, it's basically starving to death. So I tell people it's an energy shortage in the brain. You know, if your brain is starving and it doesn't have any energy, of course you're going to be forgetful. Of course you're going to have personality changes.
Well, but we're told that the brain needs 200 grams of glucose a day. So how do you line up those two things?
Yeah, we often hear that the brain requires a certain amount of glucose, and there's two ways to look at that. The brain does require some glucose. I mean, as much as on low carb and ketogenic diets, we know the body can run on other fuels. To my knowledge, it's never been shown that we are able to have zero glucose. I mean, there's a reason our blood sugar never goes to zero. So what a very low carb diet can do is at least when you don't eat a lot of carbohydrate, your body has to get fuel from somewhere else. It's going to burn fat, and in the process of burning fat, it's going to generate these things called ketones that are another kind of fuel the body can use. The brain loves ketones. So if the brain is using some ketones for its energy, then it needs less glucose. It doesn't need the full amount that we're normally told it needs. And even if it does need that amount, we can make that amount internally. I always say the body is like the ultimate recycle and reuse machine. It's really good at converting stuff into other stuff. And it can create its own glucose from a lot of other things. So even if, I mean, think about fasting, right? Fasting is all the rage now, but look at even hundreds or thousands of years ago, people would fast for religious reasons.
Still.
If the brain needed glucose every day, then the body must have some way of providing it even when you're not eating anything, or fasting for a day would kill you. It doesn't. People fast for weeks at a time. And so whatever amount of glucose the body requires, we can either get it without eating glucose, without eating carbs, or by making up some of that fuel from something else, we don't need quite as much of the glucose.
Now, you mentioned ketones a couple times, and aren't those dangerous? Isn't there some problem that people get concerned about there?
Yeah, so if that ketogenic and ketosis, they're very loaded words because if you are familiar with diabetes, especially type 1 diabetes, there is a situation called ketoacidosis that is absolutely, it's dangerous. It can be life-threatening. They call it acidosis because when ketone molecules build up to really, really high levels, they are acidic and they overwhelm the body's normal acid buffering system. Your blood starts to become acidic. That is definitely a situation we don't want. But when you're on a really, really low carb diet where your body is just making a little bit of ketones, in a person that does not have diabetes, all of the feedback loops and control systems work properly so that the ketone level never gets anywhere near that dangerous level. The acid system works perfectly and there's no issues. And so ketones are they're not dangerous under the proper circumstance. In fact, not only are they not dangerous, they can be life-saving.
Okay, and if we think about the environment that a human being would have experienced 20, 30,000 years ago, or further back. There would not be the ready sources of starch. Even, the ancestor of the potato looked nothing like what it looks like today. Sugar wouldn't have been available except maybe if they found a honey tree. Those sorts of differences, we must have been running on fat as fuel and therefore been producing ketones, and our systems must have evolved under that kind of a situation, as opposed to the environment that we have today with this, one could argue, alternate fuel source, this ready carbohydrate.
Yeah, I mean, out on the tundra when you're trying to spear that mammoth or whatever the situation may have been, you couldn't make your blueberry and chia and pineapple smoothie. You just couldn't do it. Never mind that there was no electricity, there was no blueberries and pineapples and chia seeds. So what are you going to do? You have to eat a fatty piece of meat, and there's no potato to go along with it as a side dish. There's no cheesecake to have for dessert. And there's a researcher named Sam Henderson who's active in the Alzheimer's world. And I'm going to butcher the quote because I haven't seen it in a while, but he wrote one of my favorite lines on this. He said something like, ketones would have served as a valuable metabolic fuel in times of food scarcity throughout human evolution. And I would say not just during times of food scarcity, but during times of starch and carbohydrate scarcity. And he said, hence, the modern diet can be considered keto deficient.
Nice.
They're not new to the human body. They're not weird. They are an absolutely normal part of human physiology. It's just something that our modern diet is so different than the diet in which these ketones are normally produced that it's rare. It's rare to be in ketosis unless you're actively trying to do it. But it wasn't rare way back then. That's the normal, a healthy body. Some people may be familiar with the term metabolic flexibility. A healthy body is able to switch seamlessly between being fueled primarily by sugar and starch and carbs and primarily by fats. It just, whatever's coming in, you burn and you have energy and you feel well and it's great. When you lose that flexibility is when you start to run into the problems. But this running on fat and producing ketones is it's built into the human cake, so to speak. It's just an absolutely normal part of human physiology.
Okay. So your book, The Alzheimer's Antidote, contains so much information, and I encourage people to pick that book up if they're not familiar with it. And we'll put links in the show notes. But surely they're working on drugs for Alzheimer's.
They are. And surely every single one of those drugs has been a colossal failure. There are drugs for Alzheimer's. Many of them do nothing. At best, they very mildly slow the progression. They do nothing to stop the progression, and they certainly don't reverse the damage. What they can do is make the damage get worse more slowly. And the thing is, I mean, I don't know how quickly we want to get into this particular matter, but talking about all those ketones, the reason that ketones are so important, especially for the brain, is that we mentioned that the primary issue in the Alzheimer's brain is that it's not able to get fuel from glucose anymore. What has been shown over and over, not just in rats and mice in petri dishes and stuff, but in actual human beings with Alzheimer's disease and with its precursor mild cognitive impairment, is that even though the brain is not really using glucose that well, it takes up and uses ketones. And cognitive function tends to be better when people are able to have those ketones. Now, it's not 100%. This is by no means a magical cure. But if the problem is that the brain is starving for fuel, at the very least, these ketones can provide a little bit of that fuel for the brain. And in my opinion, that is the most promising, most encouraging thing about the whole situation. And so, yeah, there are drugs, but the drugs are doing nothing to attack the underlying disease process. I mean, here's the thing. Let's take a step back. We said earlier that, you know, the chronically high insulin, and you said, Ben Bickman said, there's no chronic disease that this doesn't make worse. Nothing. And I would agree, there's no part of the body that isn't affected. Like, look at somebody with diabetes. They get problems with their eyes, the kidneys, the blood vessels, the feet, the everything, right? The number one cause of death in type 2 diabetics is cardiovascular disease. So everything is, why do we think the brain is spared? Why do we think that the brain is immune to all of these other assaults happening in the rest of the body? It is not immune. If anything, it is the most susceptible. One of the things that people report pretty quickly when they go on a low carb or ketogenic diet is that brain fog goes away. And brain fog is not Alzheimer's disease, but it's like a super, super, super mild form of maybe the brain not having quite enough energy.
And I think Dr. Eid has said something along the lines of science has conclusively proven that the brain is part of the body. So the fact that things might be, you know, connected in that way shouldn't be a surprise. I think that it's also fair to say that whatever sort of lifestyle effect we might see, your chances are improved the earlier in the progression. I hate to use that word here, but the earlier in the course you intervene, the better the results, I guess. And that's no different than anything else.
Yeah,
You
well,
know, avoiding.
that's a critical point, because with Alzheimer's disease, people think of this as like an old people disease, like, oh, grandma's getting senile, grandpa's losing his mind. They can measure this as the brain starts to lose the ability to burn that glucose. That is measurable with a PET scan in people as young as their 30s and 40s. This disease process starts decades before you start to show the symptoms of, and I tell people, the memory loss, the cognitive decline, the behavioral changes, those are the symptoms. That's not the disease. The disease is that your brain is starving to death. That's, I
Right.
mean, I don't mean to laugh. That's the disease. By the first time you start showing the memory loss, that disease process has been going on for a long time. So this is something we have to be concerned about in much younger years.
And
That's not to terrify people. It's more
yeah.
of a wake-up call. Just, you know.
Well, I would say hopeful, right? Because right now, for most people to hear that diagnosis means sort of this inevitable course, and
Yeah.
maybe not, but the other similarity that I'm thinking of is that, and you mentioned it earlier, if we're relying on fasting glucose or elevated, you know, hemoglobin A1C levels to diagnose diabetes, we may be a decade too late. If we had looked at insulin, we could have seen it and avoided damage. So it's a similar thing there.
Yes.
I think that, okay, maybe that's enough information for somebody else to go, oh, okay, these things sound too familiar. There's a family history, whatever. I've been, you know, trying to lose weight and haven't been able to, or I've been trying before, but people talk me out of it. So we've given them enough information to say, make a change, or you're not going to kill yourself by doing this. What are some practical sorts of, you know, how to get started? Because you weren't here 15 years ago, right? You've evolved over a period of time. And what's the best way to increase somebody's chance of success by making it simple at the beginning?
Right. Well, I will put in a teeny tiny plug. I have a new book coming out. It's called End Your Carb Confusion, co-written with Eric Westman, MD,
Who?
who, you never heard of that Westman clown? So Dr. Westman, for those who don't know, is just really active in the keto research and the low carb research. For over 20 years, he's been, you know, publishing clinical trials. Anyway, yeah, when I was new to this, it was so long ago that Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and Reddit and Instagram didn't even exist. like I mentioned, there was the Atkins book, there was a book called Protein Power, and there was like one forum, like an old school message board online. And it's so great that this way of eating has become so popular and there's so much information now, but there's also a lot of misinformation and a lot of confusing and conflicting information. And so this is doable on any budget with any cooking skill. If you live for the Food Network and you have every gadget and you want to cook a gourmet meal every night, great. If you want to go through the drive-through and get a burger patty without the bun or the grilled chicken patty without the bun, that's great too. The number one what makes this way of eating work, what makes all those changes happen, is the absence of the carbs in your diet. However you choose to do that, if you have the budget to go to your local farm stand and get all pasture-raised meats and organic this and that, do it. I absolutely support that kind of agriculture. If that's not in the budget, go to the discount chain, get the big old 5-pound tube of ground beef. That's great too. And really, what makes this work is the absence of the carbs. All the other stuff is gravy, and without not thickened with flour gravy, but you'll hear all kinds of stuff online that makes this way complicated, and you can make this as complicated as you want it to be, or you can keep it as simple as you want to be. You can crack open a can of sardines and cut up a cucumber, and there's lunch.
And you can crack eggs into a pan with butter and scramble them up. You can throw some other meat in with those.
If you keep kosher, despite what you see online, you don't have to eat bacon. If you don't like avocado, you don't have to eat avocado. If you're allergic to coconut, like, it's entirely customizable. You even can do it as a vegetarian, like as long as you're getting enough eggs and dairy. If you're vegan, it's much more difficult, and I don't recommend it. You can do it. I don't recommend it, but this is entirely customizable. Like, whatever food you like, you can have it as long as it's low in carbs.
Mhm. And again, these are the readily digestible carbohydrates. So people don't necessarily need to fear kale or, although I really am not a fan of kale except as
You
a
might fear
forage
kale
crop.
just because it's gross.
Well,
I'm
I
not big.
like it. I like it as a forage crop. It's great. I mean, it works
The
real.
cows can have it all they want.
Yes, and then we can have the steak afterwards, so that's great. Um, so
Am I the
what?
first nutritionist ever to have said that kale is gross? Hey,
Well,
if
there
you're
is that.
listening, if you
There
like
is
kale,
that.
I love collard greens.
Yeah.
I live in North Carolina, so we've got some really good barbecue joints here that do the collards. Kale, not so much. Ugh.
There's the meme about cooking your kale with bacon grease because it helps it slide out of the pan when you throw it away.
Into the trash,
Um,
helps it get into the trash quicker.
so um, we've let's talk about fruit. As you know, what sorts of fruits would fit or not fit in general?
Yeah, that's a good question, because for people that are new to this, it it's very different from what we're used to hearing as a healthy diet. When we say no fruit, no beans, no whole grains, and it's not that those foods are bad for you. I mean, millions of people, billions of people around the world eat those foods, and they're healthy, they're lean. It just depends. If you have a metabolic illness, if you're living with obesity, you cannot eat the same things somebody can eat who's already healthy that doesn't have those problems. So anyway, it's weird for people to hear that, well, no, you need to avoid fruit, at least for now. Fruit is just sugar. It's nature's candy. And like you said before, today's fruit it's been cultivated and bred to be much sweeter than it ever was. That doesn't mean you can't ever have it. You can have everybody's carbohydrate tolerance varies. And we actually talk about that in our book, how to find your threshold. So the lowest sugar fruits are going to be the berries, the things like raspberries, strawberries, blackberries, and what was I going to say? Fruit
The,
does not affect blood sugar quite as much as some other, forms of carbs and starchy foods do, but they have a different impact on insulin and the liver.
hmm,
So fruit is not really quite as benign as we've been told.
okay.
And it depends if you want to get nitpicky, the botanical fruits, things that we normally consider vegetables that are technically fruits, like bell peppers and zucchini, things with the seeds on the inside, tomatoes, those are technically fruits. Those are fine to eat on low carb.
Hmm.
We tend to think of the vegetables that grow above the ground are going to be lower in carbs than things that grow underground that are starchy roots, like potatoes and parsnips and beets and rutabaga and whatever.
Hmm.
The rutabaga is kind of low, but yeah, fruit is very
Radishes,
sweet.
radishes.
Also, there are exceptions because radishes are actually very, very low in carbs, and onions and shallots are kind of they're permitted. You just can't have a ton of them.
And some people may find over time that individuals, even though they would fit from a carb perspective, maybe they can't deal with them for digestive reasons or sensitivity. So
Yeah.
people need to know that they should pay attention to what's happening. And
And
sometimes people get really restrictive to figure out what they can't have, but that's a different thing from the general.
yeah, that's the digestive stuff is separate from the effects on the blood sugar and insulin. But I will point out, we're so used to hearing fruits and vegetables, fruits and vegetables. We say them together as if they're the same thing. They are not.
Mm.
A bowl of grapes or a giant apple or a giant banana or some dried mango is very different metabolically on your blood sugar and insulin than cauliflower and eggplant and spinach. So I hate that phrase, fruits and vegetables.
Mhm.
Um, and we are told that fruit is so healthy and so important. Just everybody keep in mind, there's nothing that you get from fruit that you can't get from something lower in sugar. Like there's whether you're talking about vitamin C or fiber or potassium. And if you ever, you'll have certain guests on, I'm sure, that will argue that some of that we don't need at all.
Mm.
But if we believe that we do need some vitamin C and we need some of these other nutrients, you can get all of that from the non-starchy vegetables. So you can get all the same nutrients without this massive effect on your blood sugar and insulin.
And it's just worth touching base on the perils of dried fruit.
Yeah, dried fruit is just more concentrated in sugar because it's just nothing. You don't even have the water to, I don't know what, slow things down or, but
Yeah.
again, it's not that dried fruit is poison. If you're one of these master cyclists and you're biking 100 miles and you want to have a handful of dried apricot because it's going to give you that quick boost, great. What you don't want to do, I'm going to steal a line from one of my favorite nutrition people. Her name is Diane Sanfilippo. She says, don't carb load for your desk job, right? If you're a marathoner, great, have a piece of bread. If you are sitting in front of your computer in your cubicle all day, maybe that's not the best time to have that trail mix with all the dried cranberries and apricots and stuff in it.
Or the driver's seat of your truck, or in the cab of your tractor, or
Right.
yeah, exactly right. Um, okay, so you also have a book about stalls. Now, we're not talking about where we put animals to keep them. What are you talking about there?
Talking about fat loss stalls, because so many people do use low carb or ketogenic diets for fat loss, and very often it works really well at the beginning, and then they kind of hit a roadblock or a stall.
Okay. And so your book about the stall slayer, what sorts of things have you found can lead to, I mean, I experienced at first it's easy and then it kind of isn't. And what sorts of things in your experience have been the most common problems for people after initial success?
Right. Well, people can check the book out at stallslayer.com, or it is on Amazon. I'm sure you'll put a link. You, it's normal actually for the diet to work quickly and powerfully at first, and then it slows down. Like that is a known thing. Slowing down is different than stopping, right? Because slow fat loss is still fat loss. If it's just not moving, The two most common things are the two that should be the most obvious, but we just kind of gloss over them. Some people are just eating a lot more carbohydrate than they realize. Over time, they just get complacent. Oh, I'll just have a piece of that. I'll have a bite of that. And some people can get away with that, but some people, in order to really keep that fat burning moving, they have to be really strict. And then the other thing, I hate to say this because I don't even like saying it for myself, there is such a thing as eating too much fat. If you're trying to lose body fat, because on keto or low carb, finally it's a way of eating where I'm allowed to have bacon and I'm allowed to have butter. And I am a coffee junkie, and I remember when I was brand new to this, the first time I put heavy cream in my coffee instead of skim milk, and it was so thick and rich, and I just thought, like, am I going to feel my arteries clogging? How is this? Am I going to have a heart attack immediately? Is it going to take a week? So we celebrate that finally we can eat fatty foods on this diet, but it's not unlimited. If you want to burn body fat, you can't just supply an endless amount of macadamia nuts and almond butter and coconut oil, because your body's going to use all that. So I hate the C word, but at some point, I like the E word, energy, rather than calories, energy.
Mhm.
If you're giving your body so much energy from your food, it doesn't need to tap into your stored energy. Those are the two biggest things. And then I'm a huge, passionate proponent for proper thyroid testing and treatment. There's a whole chapter on thyroid, because if your thyroid hormones are out of whack, no matter what you do with diet and exercise, you're going to have a really hard time losing body fat. And it's much more common in women than in men, but men can get it. It's just way more common in women.
So, can you confirm that a handful of nuts is the amount you can physically hold in one hand? Is that right? Or is
Well, I guess that's the definition of handful, right?
right,
And
but
so something like nuts are allowed on keto, but a lot of people are better off avoiding them because they're a trigger food, right? I call it hand to mouth syndrome. You sit down on the couch with the bag of almonds, you're meant to have a handful. Before you know it, 3/4 of the bag is gone. And cheese is the same thing. It's very easy to overdo cheese. And it's just, these foods are allowed. They're just so easy to go overboard. And they're such concentrated sources of fat that you can eat a huge amount of them without realizing. You
Mhm.
meant to have a snack, and before you know it, you've had 1,200 calories worth of cheese. So, yeah, nuts. If I tell my clients, if you are the rare person that can have an ounce or even 2 ounces of nuts, put the package away and go on with your day, you can have nuts.
Mhm. Yes.
Not
And
everyone can
again,
do that.
no, I am not one of those people. Um, and again, this is an individualized approach for every person and situation. Um, and so I appreciate that perspective. But again, this is whatever you can afford. Like, we're not talking about creating financial strain and hardship on people. It's learning to buy different foods. Now, I understand in some situations it may be trickier because of SNAP and things like that, but even there, we should learn the sorts of things, and then other people should be working at ways to change those systems. Um, but you you can buy canned meats at the supermarket, and you can buy, as you said, the store brand hamburger rather than the top of the line branded
Yeah,
product, and
this
eggs on lost leader and those sorts of things.
Yes, and this is a huge sticking point for me because some people make this way of eating sound elitist, and it has to be grass-fed and it has to be this. My co-author, Dr. Westman, works in a regular clinic with people that are on Medicaid. They may be indigent. They have a fourth-grade education. These people are not going to go to the fancy schmancy hippy-dippy co-op and spend $18 a pound for T-bone steaks. And we need an approach to this that's going to work for everybody, regardless of the budget, regardless of the accessibility. So, yeah, the number, again, what makes this effective is a very low carb intake. The fact the food doesn't have to. it doesn't work because the food is organic or it's free range or this or that. It works because we're making a biochemical shift in the body, and that shift happens when the carbs are really low.
And I've used an analogy of this is the short stave in the barrel. This is the thing that will produce 80% of the improvement, this thing.
Yeah.
And once we do that, then maybe some other things can be noticed and measured and rectified. But until you deal with this problem, I have a hard time understanding from my training and background how you could measure the effect of some of these other interventions if you've got hyperinsulinemia functioning.
Yeah.
So I'm
One thing
real.
oh, go ahead.
No,
Well,
please.
I just want to say that if I think you're trying to reach a broader audience than what we call our little low carb bubble. So for people listening that are new or watching that are new, um, you'd be surprised. I know it's sounds like a radical diet because it's just so different from what you might be used to doing. It was radical for me. I mean, I used to live on cereal, granola, pretzels. I mean, oh my God.
Oat
But
bran Cheerios.
yeah, or just like I never met a cereal I didn't like. Even
Mm.
the high fiber, boring cereals, the more the merrier. But you will be amazed at how not difficult this is. You might have to white knuckle it for a couple of days. You'll be amazed once you eliminate that stuff from your diet. For most people, not everybody, but most people, the cravings actually go away. And the way that this thing changes your metabolism, your appetite is going to be much more well regulated. You are going to have less hunger. You're going to have much less need to snack between meals. And it's something that you really can't believe it until you experience it. And the thing is, if you keep that cycle going, we tell people in the book, you don't appease a craving like, oh, you're craving cake, well, just get it out of your system, just have the cake. No, you don't. That doesn't satisfy the beast and make it go away. That makes it hungry for more. You have to starve the beast, and then when it realizes, oh, I'm never going to get fed, then it goes away. But anyway, yeah, I believe me, I know this sounds like a very radical, like I could never give up my fruit or my bread, but you will. It is. Dr. Westman's patients tell him that it's easier than they thought it would be.
And kidney dialysis is hard. And
Yeah, yeah. Good point. Losing a
you
foot
know,
is hard. What's hard? Would you rather eat a ribeye steak and some roasted broccoli, or be hooked up to a machine 3 times a week?
tough choice. Let me weigh that one out. And not to be flippant, because it's a tremendous burden on far too many people. I think the figure is something like every day in the United States, 200 people have some part of their body cut off because of diabetes. And every 30 seconds, someone in the world loses a lower leg due to diabetes.
Well, think about these numbers and look what's going on with COVID now. And everyone, the vaccine, they're mobilizing the entire country to find a vaccine. Never mind that millions of people die from these metabolic diseases every year. Where's the fire there?
Yeah.
We're just letting the house burn and we're watching it happen.
And it's not just in the affluent West, the high income countries, it's globally. And imagine the burden on people in low income countries that, so that's something that we could talk about another day. And I hope we get the chance. I hope we get a chance to do it soon in person, because
In person, yeah.
I miss seeing the Herdmates in person and listening to presentations. But I'm very, very, very grateful for all you're doing. Again, toitnutrition.com is your website, and Toit Nutrition is your Twitter handle, correct?
Yeah, and that's also the name of my YouTube channel. And just we've hit this weird little hiccup with my website. If you put toitnutrition.com, you're going to get an error. You literally have to put www.toitnutrition. But people, they'll search, it'll come up easily enough, they'll find it.
Or look for Amy Berger, maybe.
Yeah.
She does have a name. I mean, come on. So, um, thank you so much for taking the time and for sharing your information. And yeah, good health to you. And until the next time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.